we're going to begin a series of messages in which we're going to start today entitled The Road to the Cross. If you don't realize that Easter's a little bit earlier this year than it was last year. It shows up another couple of weeks earlier than what it had last year. And so we're going to be talking about the road to the cross. And so today I want to just begin by getting you into the book of Mark. Rarely ever do we ever just preach from the book of Mark for Easter services. So I just want to get you into the book of Mark and throughout the next few weeks as we look at Mark chapter 15 and 16. And we'll look at the road to the cross this coming through up to Easter. And then we'll look at the road that leads from the cross after Easter and see what the Lord is really doing and what He intended for His church to be and what He intended for the church to do. And so hope you get that. And so this morning, as we look at this, we need to understand that it's almost like a scene has been played out. All the people are in place. Everyone knows their part. Their lines have been read out. We get to the point where now in Mark chapter 15, where Jesus is going to encounter different people along the way on His road to the cross. I've entitled the message this morning, Do You See What I See? When we read the Scriptures, do we really see what the Lord sees when it comes to the book of Mark? This here passage is where it's about the aftermath of what took place before the Jews and Pilate. Right after he's met them. He's been condemned. He stood before Pilate. He went before the Sanhedrin. They have now condemned him as a man who was accused of blasphemy. They've gotten to the point now where they've sent him on to Pilate, and Pilate has to come to an understanding in his mind where he's going to, believe it or not, Pilate has a conscience. Pilate says when he goes for him, I don't see anything wrong with this man. I don't find any guilt in this man. Why do you bring him to me? Go judge him for yourself. They said, no, you have to judge him. He needs to die. You see, one of the things the Jewish people couldn't do was sentence somebody to death. And so they wanted Pilate to sentence him to death. And Pilate did everything he could to set him free. But nothing he did would allow the religious leaders. They would not allow him to do that. And the Jews, they didn't want to have anything to do with Jesus, even though He was the Messiah in which, the Bible the Scriptures had prophesied about. They rejected Him, and they sent Him away to His death. Pilate's condemned Jesus at this point to die, and just to save his position in Rome. So he didn't want to have an uprising on his hands from the Jewish people. And so he says, well, whatever you want. If that's what it's going to take to bring peace to you, that's fine. And so we're just beyond the point where there's been, Jesus has been brought out and with Barabbas. And there has been, he's actually a hardened criminal. He was an enemy of the state, so to speak. And yet they chose Barabbas over Jesus. And so today we're going to follow Jesus from Pilate's judgment hall to Calvary, where he ends up dying. First thing we need to see as we're on our road, we need to be able to see Jesus and the soldiers. Read with me then Mark chapter 15. Picking up in verse 15, we'll go down through verse 20. The Bible says this. Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over, to be crucified. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him. They twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him, and they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him, then led him out to be crucified. The Jewish leaders had rendered their verdict, as we've already said. If you look back in verse 64 of chapter 14, they've already rendered their verdict. The people had rendered their verdict as they cried out for Barabbas to be set free. Pilate has rendered his verdict here in verse 16 of chapter 15 of verse 15. And so now everything has been set for Jesus to be brought before these men. The Jews have accepted the blame for his death. And Christ said, you let it be on us and our children. Could you imagine? Allowing yourself to not only take the blame for something like that, but then say, and let it be on our children as well. Wow. It'd be like me getting in trouble for something or asking for some type of punishment and then say, and even put it on my son Trey and my daughter Kelsey. And that's what they've done. And so let's just look at some of the things that's taken place between Jesus and the soldiers. One of the things that we see is where they call it flogging or scourging. Scourging. Maybe as you're reading your King James Bible, you would see the scourging that takes place. When the soldiers got their hands on Jesus, that's what they did. They began to abuse him. They really had no care for condemned people. After all, they could do anything they wanted to short of killing them. So that they didn't have to worry about they didn't kill him as far as in the formal execution. They couldn't take his life before them, but they could do anything up to that point. And so they scourged him. They flogged him, the Bible says. And when I was a boy, my daddy says, if you don't quit what you're doing, you're going to get a flogging. Maybe you had that word used around your house. You knew when there was a whipping and then when there was a flogging coming. Daddy says, I'm going to flog you if you don't go away and leave me alone, or if you don't stop messing with your brothers, or if you don't do what I tell you to do, you're going to get flogged. It was quite another thing to say you're going to get a whipping. You knew the difference. Now, we weren't beat with, a cat of nine tails or nothing like that, but we knew when we got a belt or a switch put on us when it felt like a flogging. But here it was a scourging that took place. The victim was stripped naked and forced to bend over a low pole where they could stretch out their muscles and expose all of their bodily parts, so that the skin on the back was stretched as tight as it could, and his hands and his feet were tied where he couldn't go anywhere. And then they would just begin to beat him with what they call a flagellum, or the instrument was also nicknamed the scorpion. Couldn't you imagine? We think about a scorpion today, and we say we don't have anything to do with a scorpion. You just know that it would inflict pain on you. But we also know it as the cat of nine tails. It's a braided whip that had pieces of bone and metal woven into it. And when you got somebody stressed out and you beat them, it would just tear the flesh. It would bruise and then gradually tear the flesh at it, and to the point to sometime where bone was exposed, or arteries and veins were severed, and blood would just run everywhere, and the muscle would be ripped. So you can imagine the pain he was in just from his scourging. And I want you to remember why Jesus allowed that horrible thing to take place. He did it because of you and I.